Hey YouTube, Ed here. So this is our last episode on how to build a fishing rod, and that is applying the epoxy finish coat to the guides and the butt wrapping area where you did your decorative butt wraps. I've got a rod behind me. We're ready to go ahead and apply the epoxy. So I will relocate the camera and I will show you step by step on how I mix it and what I do to apply it, and we'll get this rod glued up. Alright, so we're ready to mix up some epoxy. Now the things you're going to need to do this job are of course it's the rod dryer or the rod roller, which I showed you in the first episode on the equipment version. But you're going to need a butane pencil torch. This is optional. You don't have to do this, but I find it extremely useful, and as inexpensive as these are, you can buy one for $15 or less, and they're refillable. This is a very handy thing, and I use it to pop the bubbles, to thin the epoxy a little bit to get a more even coating on the guides. So this is very, like I said, it's optional. You don't have to do it, but it sure does make it easier. You'll need a mixing cup, a rod builder's brush for applying the epoxy. You'll need the epoxy finish itself, whatever brand or version that you want to use. And I use a little denatured alcohol as well to help thin the epoxy a little bit, and I'll show you that when I mix it up. So basically, with most of these finishes, these two-part epoxy finishes, they're two parts, and they generally take equal amounts. I haven't used them all. This brand does. It takes a 50-50 mixture, and it's very precise. So they come with, or you could purchase these little syringes that are graduated in cc's. So if you put in 2 cc's of epoxy hardener, you also need 2 cc's of the resin. I recommend mixing no less than a total quantity of 4 cc's because it just makes everything easier to mix. So if you've got one small little guide repair, or if you got to fix like 1 or 2 little guides and you need to mix them up, if you can possibly wait, I would recommend waiting so you can mix up a bigger batch until you have multiple projects you can work on. If it can't wait, you can mix up 1 cc of each, and it will mix. You just have to be extremely thorough with it and be very sure that you get it all mixed completely. It's just harder to do with lesser quantities. So at any rate, so what we do is I take it and I put the syringes right in the neck of the bottle like this, and I pull down, and I'm going to mix up a full 3 cc's of each to do 1 fishing rod. So there's 3 cc's of the hardener, and it really doesn't matter which kind you put in the cup first. You can do the hardener first, you can do the resin first, it just really doesn't matter. Same thing with the resin. We did 3 cc's of hardener, we'll do 3 cc's of resin. We put that in there. So now we have a total of 6 cc's. Now what I do is I add a few drops of denatured alcohol, and I do this for a couple of reasons. One, this particular brand of finish, it's what's called a medium build or a medium viscosity. It's a little bit thick. It's like the consistency of cold maple syrup. So what I do is I add a few drops of denatured alcohol to thin it down a little bit. And this does 2 things. One, it allows the epoxy finish to penetrate the threads a little better, and it allows it to adhere itself to the rod. And 2, it also helps remove the bubbles when you mix this. Now you can see right in here, hopefully you can see inside there, there's some bubbles in that epoxy, and when I add this denatured alcohol, most of those bubbles will go away, and it just helps give you a clearer finish. So what I do is I have 6 cc's of total epoxy here. I put in 6 drops of denatured alcohol, and then that's how I start, and then I kind of judge by the thickness how thick it is as to whether or not I need more. But for 6 cc's you'll never need more than 10 drops. 10 drops will make it too thin. So I'll do 6 to 8 drops of denatured alcohol. So I just put it in a syringe and I slowly squeeze it and I get drops out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's just go with 8 because past experience tells me I know I need that much. Then I take the back side of the paintbrush or the rod builder's brush and mix it up. Now if you mix up too violently or too vigorously, you're going to incorporate air into the epoxy and it's going to put bubbles in there, and it's going to make it that much more difficult to get the bubbles out later. And so just don't mix too crazy. Just be thorough with your mixing. Scrape the brush on the sides of the cup and just mix it up nice and gentle. I usually try to keep it mostly on the edges, cutting through in the middle a little bit every once in a while, but just mix it up. Some guys say you can just mix it like crazy to get it thoroughly mixed and then take care of the bubbles later, and that is an option. But I don't like to put out fires, I like to prevent them. So rather than having the bubbles in there in the first place, let's just put it on as bubble free as possible. Now you're always going to get some bubbles and there's no way around it, and there's no way to avoid it, but why make more work for yourself? So mix it pretty thoroughly. Some manufacturers actually say you should mix for 2 to 3 minutes. Some manufacturers will tell you to mix until you achieve a degree of clarity in the epoxy. Some manufacturers just say mix thoroughly. So it's kind of a judgment call. With the Pro Coat, I generally find that when you mix the two parts together, it has a little bit of cloudiness to it. And then once it's thoroughly mixed and completely mixed, that cloudiness goes away and it's almost crystal clear. So you can kind of judge. Now what I do, see there's a lot of bubbles in this, and I mixed it up a little too vigorously because while I was talking with you, I wasn't paying very good attention. I'll add another drop of alcohol here to help alleviate some of those bubbles. In fact, I'm going to show you kind of a neat experiment here. Just for the sake of the video. Let me get it on camera here. Okay, you can see the bubbles in the epoxy, hopefully. Let me reorient the camera here. Okay, you can see the bubbles in the epoxy. Okay, there I am. If I put in a drop of alcohol, you should actually be able to see those bubbles going away, and they did go away a little bit. There's the cup, there it is. So then as I mix it up, you can see the bubbles are almost gone now. Just from a couple of drops of denatured alcohol. So that'll just help keep the bubbles down a little bit, and it'll also thin the epoxy. That's not too thin, we're okay. So we've got our epoxy mixed up. I'm going to shut the camera off, I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to orient it to the rod so we can show you how to apply it to the rod. Alright, so we're back and we have a glimpse of the rod that we're going to put the epoxy on. And we're first going to do the butt area, or the butt wrapping. You can see here's the front of my reel seat. This is the decorative stuff with my company logo, and monogrammed it with the name of the individual who's ordered the rod. So we're basically going to do this whole butt section of the rod. So basically, all you do is you get some epoxy on your rod builder's brush, and the first thing I like to do is I like to come up right to the edge here and go around the winding check. Just let the brush ride around the winding check as the rod turns on the rod turner, and get a good coat on the winding check. Because what I find with this epoxy is as you wet the threads with the epoxy, it'll blend in to all the areas that have been exposed previously. It might be thin, but as long as there's some on there, it'll follow into that area. So I like to go up right to the winding check using a very sparing amount just to get a kind of an edge line of where I want that epoxy to end up. And then I can start adding epoxy. And then what you do is now it's you just go for it. There's no real rhyme or reason. You just take your brush and you just glob it on there. Just put it on nice and heavy, keeping the cup underneath, letting it drip off. Catch it in the cup if you can, so you can use it on other parts of the rod. But this is where it can get kind of messy, so don't be doing this on your wife's brand new mahogany kitchen table, because she's not going to be happy when you're scraping epoxy finish off of the brand new kitchen table. So you just glop it on there heavily and catch the excess. This is where the paper towels come into play. You kind of keep that underneath, and if it drops on the paper towel, so be it. But I try to catch it in the cup. Just all you have to do is make sure you get 100% coverage. This is the most important point right here. It's not how much you get on there, it's just that you get every little square inch of the rod blank covered with epoxy finish. And like I said, just glop it on there heavy. The first rod I used a plastic spoon and just poured it on there, and it dripped off into the cup, and it worked just fine. But obviously you get much better control with the brush. So now we're coming to the edge of my first set of threads here, and I don't want epoxy to go past those first sets of threads. So then I take my brush and I wet the threads right up to the edge. Make sure I got enough epoxy on there to do just that. Now you can do as heavy or as light of an edged glue line as you want. If you want the glue line on your threads to go 1/8 of an inch past, you can take your brush and you can put it on there 1/8 of an inch past the edge of the threads. And that's where the glue line will stop, because that's how far you've put it on there with a brush. And then you can just finish globbing it on there. And it won't go past there unless you get ridiculously heavy with it, but it'll take it right to the edge of the glue line. Okay, so there we've got my logo on there. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the rest of it. Go to the edge of a glue line where I want the glue to stop. You can see here I've got a hook keeper in place. I'm just wetting the edges is all I'm doing here. I'm not sealing it. And this certainly isn't the finished amount. I'm just wetting the edge. That's where I want my glue line. Now I take and I just glob on epoxy. And I do that all the way to the edge. Now the point being here is that you want to soak these threads so that they adhere completely to the rod. And on these areas where there's no threads, the point is to seal the decals so that over the course of time the ink doesn't rub off and become invisible. So you're basically just protecting everything with the finish to this point in this area of the rod. When we get up to doing guides, what the point of the epoxy is to lock the threads into place. The epoxy actually isn't holding the guides. The epoxy is holding the threads. The threads are doing the work of keeping the guides attached to the rod. So like I said, again, we're just globbing it on, not being too terribly cautious as to how much is getting put on there, just making sure that it is 100% covered. This is the most important thing. 100% coverage. This does take some time. I figure on an average fishing rod with a full butt section, it takes approximately 40 to 50 minutes to include mixing up the glue. you're going to want to set yourself some time, a dedicated time, because once this glue is mixed, you got to get it on there. Now it's got a relatively long pot life. In fact, the rod I'll rotate this rod on this rod dryer for approximately 12 hours. In 6 hours it will be pretty dry. It'll still be tacky. In fact, it'll be tacky to the point where if you touch it, you'll leave a fingerprint on it. But it won't be so tacky or so wet that you can shut the rod dryer off. It won't sag off. Now the point of the rod dryer is to keep the rod spinning, and what happens is this epoxy or this finish coating is self-leveling. So as long as the rod is rolling or turning, it won't drip off, it won't sag, it'll self-level, and it'll be a nice even coating all the way around. Now you can see I got a little epoxy on my finger there. Here's where your paper towels come into play. So I kind of wipe my brush off. Now what we've got here is we've got the butt section pretty much covered. In fact, it is covered 100%. Now we take our little pencil torch, and it's time to dispense with the bubbles. Now let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Maybe I can get some bubbles to show up here. Is there some bubbles there? I hope you can see some bubbles in that. That's the hook keeper, and there should be some bubbles. We should be able. I see them in there with my naked eye, but the camera might be having some difficulty. So hopefully it comes out. Let me put you down just a little bit here. Okay. Hope that focuses well enough. So there's bubbles in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pencil torch, and we're just going to very quickly, you're not going to hold it there, you're just going to brush a flame across it to pop the bubbles. So I got to start my torch. I see bubbles. I just brush the flame across very quickly. You notice I don't stop, I don't hold it there. And I hope that's showing up on the camera, but you can see now the bubbles are all gone. And now we have a nice clear finish. Now, well, this also does one other thing. This makes the epoxy runny. So what it does is it also helps to even it out. So what I'll do now is, I know there's bubbles all the way along here, is I'll take my torch, I'll light my flame, and I'll very quickly whisk it across the whole area, watching for bubbles, never keeping it in one spot, never stop moving. If you stop moving, it's going to smoke off or burn off, and then you got to add more, and then you also run the risk of scorching the rod or scorching the threads. So never ever stop. The other problem is if you get too much heat to the epoxy, you'll yellow it. And that you don't want to yellow the epoxy at all. So you just got to keep it moving. Now I can see I've got some drips there. What I do is I take my brush and I capture the drips on the end of my brush, and I take off the excess epoxy and I'll put it back in my cup. You can also catch it back in your cup, but now once you've heated that epoxy up, you shortened its working time or its pot life. So you got to work a little quicker now, and this will actually get to the point in about 10 or 15 minutes where you can't even use it. So if I want to try and save a little bit of the epoxy, say I got just enough to do 1 or 2 more guides, I'll put the cup underneath it while I'm doing this, and I'll catch the drips. And actually you'd be surprised at how much a few drips will cover when it comes to doing guides, because guides don't take a lot of epoxy. They take a very minimal amount. You use up all your epoxy finish doing this decorative butt wrapping, because you're trying to cover a large surface area. A guide, you've got less than an inch of area that you're trying to cover. So here we're just popping bubbles, catching the drips. I cannot stress enough how important it is to never stop moving if you're going to use that pencil torch in that manner to get rid of bubbles. I cannot stress how important it is to make sure that you don't overheat the finish. It will yellow, it will not look as nice, and it'll cook off and it'll smoke off, and then you'll have dry spots. And the only way to fix that is to go back and put on another coat. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause the camera. I'm going to take you over to the biggest guide, and we're going to lay epoxy on that guide. All right, now we're on the largest guide, or the stripper guide, which is the first guide coming off of the reel seat. And this is the only guide I'm going to do. I'm not going to bore you with doing all the guides. You basically do them all the exact same way. So I got some epoxy in my cup. I take my brush and I wet the edge. This is where I like my epoxy finish to have a line, and I just hold it steady in one spot, let the rod dryer do the rotation, let it roll around a couple of times. I get good 360-degree coverage, and I've got a wet edge. That's where the epoxy will end up. Now I gloop on some epoxy, being fairly liberal with it, making sure that all the threads get coated. Again, you don't have to be too terribly careful as to how much you put on, but what I do find is if you put too much on, it is hard to clean it up later, so I try to only put on just a little bit more than what I think I'm going to need so that I can remove some and not get, because what will happen is you get a big ball at the end of at the bottom of your guide foot there, which is unsightly. Now what I also try to do is when I wet the edge of the thread at the base of the guide, is I try not to get too far over the edge. Just bring it right to the edge, and I find that that is enough. It will soak through the threads, it will get down, and it'll get good contact with the guide and the blank, and that is enough. You can put a little on the bottom of the guide foot, but to go over the edge like this, I find is just oftentimes too much. And if you do go over the edge, don't go much more than about a 1/16 of an inch. Just a very minimal amount. I am going over the edge now because I slipped with my brush, and I'm correcting it. So there it is. I've got a 1/16 of an inch wet edge on the guide foot. Now you say, well, that's very uneven. Yes, it is. It's extremely uneven. And it's also got bubbles in it. So I take my pencil torch and I run it over quick again. Notice how I'm not stopping. I'm moving very, very fast. It levels it out. Should drip off a drop here. No, it's not going to drip it off, so I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to help it out. I'm going to get rid of that drop on the bottom. In fact, I'm going to help it out a couple, 3 times here, because I don't want to get a big ball at the base of my guide foot. I want just enough to seal the thread on the guide. And there it is. That guide is epoxy finished on. I won't have to touch that now. There's no bubbles in it. It's nice and clear. I may have to come back in a little bit, because what will happen is right here where the guide foot is, it'll dry a little bit because the epoxy will soak through and it'll make contact with the rod, and it'll get a little dry spot. So I might have to come back and put just a drop of epoxy there later just to make sure that it stays wet. But that, in a nutshell, is how to apply epoxy finish to your rods. It's a relatively fast process, but if you don't do it correctly, it will completely ruin your rod project. So you want to make, what I would suggest is, I would suggest you practiced on perhaps something that doesn't matter. Maybe a piece of dowel with some guides on it. So, and then now what we'll do is we'll let it sit here and we'll let them rotate for about 10 or 12 hours and finish drying. Alright, so we've applied finish to our fishing rods, and they are rotating, and we're going to let them dry for 12 hours. I hope this was informative. It was quick, it was down, it was dirty. It was just to show you how to get the epoxy on the rod. But the biggest thing is if you use the pencil torch, don't overheat the epoxy, because it'll yellow and it'll shorten the pot life. And I actually think it'll shorten the life of the finish as you fish the rod for the years to come. and you'll actually cook it off. So just very light, quick, fast with the torch, and just never stop, and just get those bubbles popped and to let the finish level out and even out. So I hope this is informative. Please subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing. Click the thumbs up or the like button if you like this video. Give me some comments, let me know how I can do things differently, and happy rod building. Thanks.